Hello, everyone, and welcome to this regional webinar. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Hana Asfour. I'm Director of the Middle East Research Network on Internal Displacement, in short, MERNID, which is supported by the Internal Displacement Research Program, School of Advanced Study at the University of London. So MERNID is a new network that we've been setting up over the past few months. We're all researchers in or on the Middle East, and we work to stimulate, share, and produce research specifically on internal displacement in the Middle East region, including Afghanistan. We are doing this because unlike the large quantity of research on refugees in our region, there's relatively little research on the issue of internally displaced persons, or IDPs. So if you're a researcher in our region and you're interested in joining MERNID, then please do message me, email me after this session. So as a moderator for this session, I'm pleased hereby to inaugurate this first series of webinars on internal displacement in the Middle East, which begins a conversation on the legal perspectives of internal displacement through 3 case studies, one in Afghanistan, another in Syria, and one in Iraq. Internally displaced persons are usually assumed to be citizens of their country who, in principle, can rely on the legal protection of their own country. Yet the enormous IDP crisis in the past decade in the Middle East call these assumptions sharply into question. So according to the latest IDMC figures, there are up to 6.5 million IDPs in Syria, 1.5 million in Iraq, and 2.9 in Afghanistan, which gives us an idea of the significance of IDP issues in these countries. The question underpinning this first seminar is, what role does law play in protecting IDPs caught up in conflict and unstable contexts such as Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan? What does this mean for the legal concepts of citizenship and statelessness in the region? The 3 case studies presented today will approach internal displacement through a legal lens and in 3 different countries. Each speaker will have between 10 to 12 minutes to present, and I hope you'll forgive me in advance for policing this strictly. Given the tight time frame, I will also only briefly introduce each speaker, but their full biographies can be seen online following the link that appears now in the Zoom chat box that you bring up on the side of your screens. During the presentations, I would like to ask that you pose your questions by typing them onto the chat box too. I'd also like to ask the speakers to read through the chat box as we go along and select questions to respond to once we finish the presentations by each speaker. Finally, please do keep your microphones on mute and your videos off unless you are a presenter. We will also be recording this session, the podcast of which will be available next week on the IDRP website. So without further ado, let me turn to our first speaker, Dr. Hidayat Siddiqui, Director of the Department of Research and Training Need Assessment, Afghanistan Civil Service Institute in Afghanistan. Over to you, Dr. Hidayat.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Hannah, for giving me this opportunity to talk on this very important topic. Since I've given only 10 minutes and you have policing it strictly, so I have to make it very shortly. I want to jump on my topic. So I'm going to speak about IDPs and crisis management in Afghanistan, analysis of legal framework and social protection policies here in Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan, I will be, my presentation will be able to give you a brief background on current IDP situation, then I move on institutional developments in terms of IDPs in Afghanistan, then I will talk briefly about legal frameworks that we have in Afghanistan, and then we move on talking about crisis management and social protection policies of Afghanistan, and then I will spotlight some of the main challenges that we have in policy and the legal frameworks for IDPs in Afghanistan. Now, the very recent report published by the IDMC Internal Displacement Monitoring Center was alarming, which is in which there was stated that by 2019, over 50 million people were displaced within their home countries. Among them, 45.7 million people were displaced due to armed conflicts and violence. Afghanistan, within that text, is fifth most, the mostly IDP populated country in the world. About 3 million. We have about 3 million IDPs in the country. However, this figure is from 2019. The weekly updates coming by United Nations organizations and other international organizations tracking this IDP displacement show that nearly every month more than 1,000 Afghans are displaced in the country. So just only in the last 3 months of the first 2001, there were more than 50,000 people have been displaced. Throughout Afghanistan, from the last 4 decades, has been facing this violence, and this has been one of the main causes of the displacement in the country. Approximately about 76% of the Afghan population has experienced displacement, forced displacements in the country. So forced displacement in Afghanistan has been a perennial crisis, and it's international and its international partners to search for a durable solution. Now, going to the history of this, the first mass movement, forced movement, started with the invasion of Soviet Union in 1979, and within 1 year, then we had over 6 million people displaced within and outside the country. And then after 1989 to 1995, there was civil war between different factions within the country, and that caused the fluctuation of numbers of IDPs in the country going high every other year. And then, of course, we didn't have the tracking in those years, so it's very difficult to find accurate numbers during that war. And after then 1996, then Taliban emerged, and again there were huge displacement within the country with the arrival of Taliban conquering every province, and from 1996 to 2001, almost 95% of the country was controlled by the Taliban, and that also led to the huge. And then we had this 9/11 incident, and then this led to U.S. intervention in the country, which led again the rise of war and conflicts in the country, which led thousands of people to be displaced again in the country. And the institutional development in terms of IDPs or forced displacement in Afghanistan started with 1989, when first displacement started with the war, with the dissolvement of monarchy and implementation of democratic regime under Communist Party. Then we had internal war, and then there were the first institution under this to deal with this crisis were named Committee for Refugee Repatriation. Then we had this committee was changed into ministry due to the rise of these and number of refugees and IDPs in the country. In 19 of Ministry of Refugee and Repatriation. Taliban, this ministry was reduced to a direct level, and it was working under the it was administered under the Ministry of Martyrs and Rebels. And after the U.S. intervention, military intervention in the country, the ministry regained its name. It began Ministry of Refugees and Repatriation, which works under this title until now. The Ministry of Refugee and Repatriation it leads generally of the legal and policy frameworks on refugees and in the country. The funding of the refugee and repatriation comes from the national budget, aid coming from international aid organizations, And the size ministries, it has 1,247 staff, 475 of them working in the center. And the department which deals with the IDPs, although we have over 3 million IDPs in the country, there's a small department under the Directorate of Policy and Plan in the ministry. The legal framework, forced displacement in Afghanistan, indeed, it's a very complex and multi-layered and multi-dimensional problem that has protection challenges due to ongoing conflict, because we are not a post-conflict country, and this really it differs region by regions in terms of criticality of the displacements, not only by conflict and also by drought or so this severity differs depending on the region. So this, we have a protected disasters happening in the country. The number of response to meet this kind of displacement challenges is not only a matter of developing a legal or legal policy framework, rather its IDP issue is more about a full-fledged or a wide range of protection intervention, and that can vary from humanitarian to prevention, protection, and socio-political protection of socio-political rights of IDPs, integrity, and all. So, however, when it comes to Afghanistan, to date, there's no specific national law for displaced people in the country to meet their basic fundamental rights. Nevertheless, what current policies or IDP policies and legal frameworks are used to protect the limited protection services are based on the Constitution, on civil and panels, and also on statutes adopted by the Assembly, and as well as the presidential decrees. For example, in terms of, if we talk about constitutional provisions, we have, for example, Article 9 in the Constitution states that it's a state's obligation to provide, to ensure equality among all ethnic groups in the country. And Article 22 in the Constitution says clearly declares that prohibition of the discrimination and the distinction between citizens. And Article 38 and 40 says the properties of individuals are considered inviolable and immune from invasion. So these codes are used in terms of developing legal framework for IDPs in the country. Similarly, the civil codes, panel codes, there are a few, for example, the Article 1903 of the Civil Code of Afghanistan states that no person is dispossessed of property except by law. And the panel code, Article 431 of the panel. So these are few legal instruments or codes and regulations that are used to develop IDP policies. There are lots of statutes also used in terms of when it comes to IDP protection policies in the country that are laws adopted, citizen law adopted in 2005, and law on education that was adopted in 2001. We have law on land management adopted in 2000, and law on mass media adopted in 2000. These are a few legal instruments that are always used in terms of developing any legal any policy providing for the country. And two of the very important key presidential decrees developed within this context was the decree number 297 that was on dignified return of refugees, which talked about the provision of equal right to those who return to the country, and provision of equal rights, social rights, political rights, and also land allowance around those who are returning back from Iran, particularly from Iran and other countries that were Afghanistan. So another decree, decree number 104, was also released by the Presidential Office, which is on the land distribution for settlement of eligible returnees and internally displaced people. So these are the few legal codes that exist within the country. Constitution, and then there are also Afghanistan is also it's good to say that Afghanistan is also party to the whole bunch of international treaties that guarantees humanitarian rights of individuals in the country. This includes guiding principles of internal displacement. It's a Geneva Convention related to the protection of civilian persons in times of war, and Convention on Rights and of Persons with Disabilities, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Convention Against Torture, and the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam, and also Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. So these are some of the few very important key international treaties in which Afghanistan is party to. When it comes to developing policy for IDPs, the Ministry can repartition this task. However, it has a lot of parties, national level and also international level. This includes like UN organizations such as UNHCR, and also other non-governmental and non-governmental organizations like Norwegian Refugee Council, and also Committee, and also IOM. And they work as a consultant, and in terms of developing IDP policies in the country, and also other ministries like we have Ministry of the Emergency, and also we have this Afghan National Disaster Management Authority, and other organizations such as Brookings are all involved in terms of developing policy or legal frameworks for IDPs. However, so far there hasn't been any legal framework developed that is specifically that deals specifically with the IDPs in the country. Now, in terms of crisis management, when we see it from a scholar academic perspective, when we define it, it's an event that disrupts or scrambles plans, interrupts continuities, and paralyzes normal operations or human lives, such as security and welfare, health, integrity, and induces a sense of urgency, because we do have a crisis like climate change, but that doesn't necessarily bring a state of urgency, but it does have a deep crisis, induced a deep crisis for a very long time. However, when it comes to crisis in terms of management, when we talk about IDPs, we talk about those that has a very quick or very soon, or not prolonged, but very on time or occurring disadvantages on people's life. So, however, there are some definitions in terms of crisis definition. That definition of situation in terms of crisis can be of political outcome, but this is not in case of Afghanistan, particularly when it comes to IDPs, because the country they're back to war. The war is going on, and the scale of war is in every other day it's escalating, particularly after this peace initiative led by the United States in February last year. And since then, the casualties has remarkably increased. We had a small study on impact on IDPs recently we conducted in 3 provinces of mostly IDP populated in Jalalabad, Kabul, and Herat, in which we came out that the most of the recent displaced people happened in the last 5 years, and mostly happened in the last 1 year. So as I just said about the report published by the UN OCHA, that in the last 3 months of this 2001, we had over 50,000 people displaced due to conflict in the country. So in Afghanistan, there are two, in terms of crisis, there are two types of crisis. Since IDPs or internal displacement issue was an issue that was happening from the last 4 decades, we didn't have any kind of mechanism to come up with a kind of constructive policy or a framework to handle this issue. So there's a process-oriented crisis within the administration with this challenge. And also, we have another crisis management in terms of other recurrent natural disasters happening, and that is that hits hard the most vulnerable people or persons or individuals in the society. That is most likely are the IDPs in the country. So whether it is process-oriented or sudden rupture.
Apologies, sorry, but would you be able to, as we are closing to the time, I just wanted to flag the time. Thanks.
Okay, just to come up with this, we do have all this crisis, and with all this crisis in hand, of course, we have few policy, and luckily we had this national policy on internal displacement, which covers all these. That is indicated in the guiding principle. However, the country lacks seriously the actual action plan to address the real necessities of IDPs. So we do have very beautiful papers developed in terms of policy, in terms of frameworks, but we do not have any kind of action plan to reach the challenges. Some of the few challenges that I want to conclude with my presentation with is I want to elaborate on some of the few challenges that we have in Afghanistan. Is first, we do not have any special document to meet the refugee challenges in the country. The second is the responsibility of a lot. We have a bunch of organizations, national, international, working on IDP issues, but there's no consensus or a strategic national holistic plan to come up with an action plans to meet all these challenges. And we do have lack of risk management skills in government institutions that are dealing with the refugee issues. And the most important shortfall is bureaupathological shortfalls, that is the incapability of staffs responding to challenges, particularly prolonged negligence of meeting the challenges of IDPs in the country. Ill-conceived, ad hocly developed policies to resolve age-old problems in the country is one of the main issues that we have in the country right now. Thank you very much for listening, although I have skipped a few things because of time. So I hope I have presented something about the IDPs in the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hidayat, for the informative presentation. It was very interesting to see, to hear about all the work that has been going on creating legal frameworks for internal displacement and the gaps or the challenges that remain and that need to be worked on. So thanks very much.
You're most welcome.
Moving on to the next speaker, Zahra Barazi, who is a lawyer and independent consultant on statelessness. Zahra, over to you.
Thank you very much. And first of all, just a thank you for allowing me to be part of this conversation and discussion today. What I want to do is to zoom in a little bit about the IDP situation in Syria. And look at the legal status. Like, the issue of legal status is quite broad, but what I want to do is look quite specifically at the legal status with regards to accessing documents for those IDPs. So as we know, the IDP situation in Syria has become very much a protracted one. The figures, Hana, you mentioned at the beginning, are quite overwhelming. 6.2 million, I think, and there's 2.5 million of those who are children, which is actually significant for many reasons, but significant for that reason of access to documentation, because birth registration and accessing birth certificates is one of the biggest challenges that often a lot of these families face. And it is at the moment the biggest internally displaced population in the world. The kind of profile of IDPs and kind of how their journey is very different. It's rarely, you know, a journey from A to B. It's a journey from A to B and then C and then back to B and then across to C and then between regime areas and non-regime areas and different governing areas. And sometimes people have left the country and then returned again. So there's a whole there's often incredibly complex journeys of these people have taken that make the issue as well of accessing documentation incredibly difficult. And of course, across the country, you have different challenges of IDPs. You've got in Idlib, for example, more than half of the population living in the Idlib city and the broader region are IDPs. So you have cities and areas that are really, really seeing the challenge of IDPs, and then not so much in other areas. And of course, you know, you've got now protracted, but also new cases. I think that's something that's forgotten in the Syrian context, is that people are becoming IDPs still to this day. Already in April, just a couple of weeks ago now, 20,000 people were displaced from Kamishli. In March, we had, because of conflict there, in March, we had nearly 9,000 people displaced because of more environmental issues, because they were living in their tents from the northwest. We have constant challenges of IDPs as well. And you're supposed to, as an IDP, of course, rely on the legal protection of your own country. But there are major challenges with regards to that. There were already challenges that existed before this conflict, before pre-2011. We have issues of the fact that digitalization had not been completed in the country. So when you go in civil registry offices, digitalization is not always had not always taken place. So a lot of things have been written out by hand, which becomes problematic for people who need to, from afar, try and access certain documentations. And then we have a lot of customary practices which take place outside of the formal legal system, such as customary marriages taking place and not being registered under the kind of legal system. So we already had pre-existing problems, and these have increased extensively because of the conflict. And of course, everybody in the country is affected at some point, can be affected by issues of access to documentation. I think I read somewhere that in some areas about 34% of children don't have birth certificates, but the vulnerability of IDPs is particular, and that's kind of what some of the vulnerabilities is what I want to mention today. So some of these vulnerabilities can be, for example, simply that documents have been lost in flight. So between point A and point B, or point B and point C, they've lost or not been able to take the documents with them. A lot of discussions I have with a lot of IDP families, one of the questions I do ask is, did you bring the specific documents? And they will say, well, we didn't because I was expecting my husband to follow him to bring it, or I was expecting my parents to come. So a lot of the time documents aren't brought or are lost. And then trying to reapply or to renew some of these documents that they don't have can be really problematic. There can be real difficulties in accessing CVRS offices once you are an IDP. This can be for, you know, reasons such as access, such as not knowing the area that you're in, not knowing where to go. But also at times they're not necessarily open for IDPs. I know in practice, for example, for a few years, registration at some of the government of Syria registration centers in Idlib were only available to people who previously been registered in that area. So that really rendered it largely inaccessible for a lot of the IDPs in Idlib. And as we saw, as I said before, Idlib it has massive amounts of IDPs there. So it could be that they can't access these offices because of, you know, problems with accessibility, but also they're not allowed to. That's also a problem. It may be also that IDPs have come with documents that are not recognized because they have been under a governing system that is not recognized in the area in which they find themselves. For example, if they've been living under areas of ISIS control and they have a marriage certificate or certificate or any type of document from that area, and they're now in this new area, those documents won't be registered, won't be recognized. So if you've got a marriage certificate that's not recognized, then it becomes problematic to register your child under the name of the father and the mother, for example. So this can also be problematic. A lot of the IDPs haven't registered or haven't even tried to register marriages or births, just because their priorities over the past decade have been different than accessing civil documentation. It's been there is definitely awareness of civil documentation being important. That's not necessarily the problem. It's just a priority when you have become or are displaced in the country. Also, we see particular vulnerabilities of IDPs, such as reports have shown there's increased, for example, child marriages amongst IDP populations, all sorts of coping mechanisms. There's also higher numbers of second marriages among IDP populations, especially when the number of men are less than the number of women. And these also can lead to problems with registration. It's much more difficult for a child marriage to be, or you can't register child marriages at court in most areas. Not true in all areas, but in most areas. And then if you can't register the child marriage, then you can't register any children that are born of that marriage. And a lot of men who marry more than one, who are in polygamous relationships, there is a condition given by the first wife that the second marriage isn't registered or the third marriage isn't registered. So having more of cases of child marriage and second customary marriages also leads to more problems with ensuring that marriage and birth and even death are registered. And then we've also got problems with issues, for example, you've been removed from your social networks. So a lot of IDPs aren't able to access coping mechanisms that are usually available for other people. That is, they don't know any lawyers in the area to try and resolve their issues with accessing documentation. They don't know how to contact lawyers from the areas that they used to be in. They often find themselves trying to go to other areas, specifically regime areas, and risking a lot in terms of security to try and get certain documentation or try and access certain documentation. So being outside of their kind of social networks also adds increased vulnerability for IDPs to try and access civil documentation. And I've mentioned now just very few kind of reasons and behind why accessing civil documentation for these IDPs is problematic. And what we've seen to date is very, very limited attempts by the regime to try and resolve some of these. There was small limited attempt to try and resolve the problem of educational certificates, but apart from that, there's been very, very little attempt to try and resolve. And the regime areas, for example, will absolutely refuse to recognize documents that come from other areas in Syria under other governing factors, in worry that it then legitimizes those governing powers. So there isn't any attempt. And then, where does this leave us? Why, amongst all the problems that a lot of these IDPs are facing, why is this necessarily a problem? There are problems that we're seeing because of the lack of documentation, is problems trying to access HLP rights, the housing, land and property rights. Especially this is specifically affecting women who already didn't have much documentation to prove their housing, land and property rights. This is going to be problematic for people accessing aid. And in the future, if we do have some kind of political process, not having documentations may mean that a lot of these people are excluded from being able to vote or even stand for election because they can't prove their identity. Another huge issue, and really is a growing problem, is the fact that if you are unable in the country to prove your link to a Syrian father, which having no documentation, not having a birth certificate that states that your father is this particular person, you don't have a legal link to a Syrian father, that means that you will be rendered stateless, because in the country, in Syria, women are not allowed to give their nationality to their children. So if you can't legally prove a link to a Syrian father, that means you won't access Syrian nationality. So it also leaves a risk of lots of children being born as internally displaced persons to be rendered stateless and not access any nationality. So those are there are many other problems also with not being able to access documentation, but those are the main ones that are very much an immediate concern for a lot of the people who are currently internally displaced in the country. I think I'll stop there. So these are just for some of the problems and then the reasons why they were challenging for IDPs, to give more time for discussion as well. I think I've overstepped my time.
Thanks a lot, Zahra. That was really interesting. I just wanted to remind everyone, if anyone has any questions, please do feel free to post them in the chat box so that we can address them following the presentation. Great. So moving on to the final speaker, who is Thomas McGee. He is a researcher at Peter McMullen Centre on Statelessness at the University of Melbourne in Australia. Thomas, over to you.
Thank you very much, Hannah. So I'm really pleased to be able to participate in this webinar today. And as has already been mentioned, internal displacement can clearly cause many legal challenges. As Zahra focused on, these often include access to civil documentation and the confirmation of legal identity for children born in displacement. What I would really like to focus on for my part is quite a specific case study, and it's that of children born to Yazidi survivors of ISIS captivity. So the Yazidis are a religious minority community in Iraq and elsewhere beyond. And I'm looking today at the situation that mothers and children find themselves in as IDPs in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. So this draws on some research that I published last year in an article entitled "Born of ISIS Genocide: Risks of Statelessness and Stigmatized Nationality Acquisition for Children of Yazidi Survivors." So maybe before going any further, it's useful to just reflect a little bit on the concept of internal displacement. And I should note that this case in some ways poses certain questions around the definition of internal displacement. And again, it's something that Zahra touched upon, when sometimes individuals have been displaced within their own country, but also outside it. So in August 2014, the Islamic State extremist group launched what's quite a notorious, extremely notorious, brutal attack on the Yazidi majority area of Sinjar in Iraq. This was part of a campaign to establish an Islamic caliphate across Iraq and Syria. So while thousands of Yazidi men were executed on the spot, thousands of Yazidi women were sold into captivity at slave markets. As a consequence, many Yazidi women who were held captive by ISIS were subject to genocidal rape and abuse in both their home country of Iraq, but also in Syria. So their crossing of the international border was clearly not for the purpose of seeking refuge, but under duress and under the decision of and control of their captors. While some of those who escaped opted to stay or be in Syria, the majority did return to Iraq. And it was in this context, while working with the IDP community in Iraq, that I encountered Yazidi survivors and their children. So I'd like to introduce the dilemma of such children through a quote by one of the Yazidi survivors. She said, "This is my son. He is 1 year old. He does not have a birth certificate or any papers. He was my only comfort when I was in captivity, but now I have no idea what will be his future." So, based on research interviews that I did with Yazidi survivors and key stakeholders, and these included lawyers, representatives of the authorities, as well as Yazidi religious figures, I argue that the legal, social, and religious frameworks in Iraq leave these children trapped between, on the one hand, risks of statelessness, and on the other hand, the possibility of acquiring a dangerously stigmatized nationality. Stigmatized due to the association with their perpetrator fathers. So I underscore the need to integrate legal and religious considerations into attempts to find a solution to this issue, while balancing protection concerns for both the survivors and the children born as a result of their ordeal. So in Iraq, the overall framework is highly complex due to the intersections between the legal, the social, and the religious. So while there are social and religious debates taking place ongoing within the Yazidi community, which are themselves highly complicated and challenging in their own right, today, given our focus on the law, I will limit myself to discussing the legal challenges. Moreover, I would also argue that the legal framework itself curtails the very space that Yazidi human rights advocates have when navigating the social and religious obstacles in search of solutions on this issue. So the legal framework can be considered to be aggravating social stigma and at the same time entrenching conservatism within religious doctrine, which of course leaves little possibility, or to date has left little possibility for humanitarian solutions to be found. So then, what is the problem with the law? Unlike many states in the Middle East, the current Iraqi nationality regime has actually overturned many elements of the historic gender discrimination within the law. So many patrilineal aspects of the law have actually been reformed. However, gender discrimination does remain in a number of key articles, and this further intersects with issues of religious identity. So significantly and very problematically, the law considers any child of an unknown father to be Muslim. And this is a detail that is visibly recorded on all forms of civil documentation in the country. So the situation of children born to Yazidi survivors of unknown fathers highlights the dilemmas caused by the presence of this religious bias embedded within the law. Despite the reforms that I mentioned to remove gender discrimination from the law, the Arabic term majhul al-nasab, which can be translated as undetermined parentage, is interpreted in practice to refer only to the father. So it's interpreted as paternity rather than parentage. So in the case where a child's paternity is unknown, they will automatically be recorded as an Iraqi citizen, but as a Muslim Iraqi citizen, irrespective of the context. So this is especially problematic given the religious dimensions of the genocidal persecution experienced by the Yazidis prior to and during their internal displacement. So in practice, such legal provisions can be considered as insensitive at best, perhaps, and perpetuating the genocide at worst. Registering children growing up with their Yazidi mothers and extended Yazidi family in internal displacement settings, often within entirely Yazidi populated camps or unfinished buildings as Muslim, based on an arbitrary prescription in law, can do nothing but increase the stigma that these children face. So labeling the child with the same religious identity as the persecutors of the community at large presents a heightened risk of family rejection, potentially ostracism, and other forms of harm towards the infant or the mother from within the traumatized Yazidi community, which no doubt adds to the vulnerability. So it's therefore really important that humanitarians promoting civil documentation acquisition be aware of this and recognize that they actually face a dilemma and need to ensure that they do no harm. In the face of stigmatized nationality, many children in such a context therefore remain undocumented and at risk of statelessness. Attempts to work on this issue from humanitarians, Yazidi activists, and lawmakers have not resulted in any comprehensive solutions. That said, and given the current impasse, as well as recent statements from Yazidi leadership figures rejecting to consider such children as Yazidi, it's really important to recall that on an individual basis, a number of creative solutions were found in the early years after 2014. For instance, one judge in Dahok was willing to consider that the father, consider that the husband of the mother prior to 2014, the Yazidi husband, could be registered as the father of the child, knowing that this was a blatant violation of the law. He was nonetheless willing to do so, as he saw that it was in the best interest of the child. Similarly, other Yazidi lawyers have worked to essentially produce alternative parental structures within the law, so often by registering an aunt or an uncle, as the parents. And obviously this requires the consent of the family members, and it's quite an irregular solution. But in addition to the consent of family members, it requires good faith of the officials. Nonetheless, faced with this impasse on more comprehensive solutions, community activists have called for the international community to step up its efforts. This includes, firstly, advocacy on reforming the law and the civil documentation system. So that would be to remove reference to religion being written on documents. And secondly, and this is a point I'd like to conclude on, activists and religious figures have repeatedly called for such cases to be prioritized for resettlement to third countries, so that a mother and child could hopefully build a new life away from the stigmatizing frameworks currently present in Iraq. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Thomas, for that interesting discussion. I think we have a couple of questions on the chat box. But first, let me say thank you to all the speakers. You've now heard from all our panel, and we will now move on to the questions that have been posed. So there was one question to Dr. Siddiqui, which says, following on from your last comment, what do you see as the best potential strategy for addressing the challenges to implementing a national policy or action plan on internal displacement, even as conflict continues in the country?
Okay, thank you very much for a very important, very nice question. In terms of best potential strategy coping at a time when conflict is going on, would be not, because the country, as I said, is experiencing war from the last 4 decades. So for the people here, for the leadership, it's known that when the conflict spikes, when we have internal displaced people increase, and also we know in the time-wise throughout the year that during which months of the year we have this severe cases, severe problems for IDPs in terms of we have severe winter, and also the country is very dry land. So these, instead of waiting for the conflicts to happen and people to come up and forced to displace and go to different provinces, all stakeholders, including government organizations and government ministries, can be proactive and can have a holistic strategy that can come up with an approach to predict that what kind of conflicts are going to happen, because we have spring violence conflicts always happens and increases during the summertime, and we have a lot of displacements, and these displaced people have very severe conditions when winter comes. So this is something that's happening in every year. So in order to avoid this, the responsible institutions should be proactive rather than waiting for the incidents to happen. And the second thing is there is a need for a holistic approach where we need, for example, in terms of information sharing, a national data bank where all stakeholders can share all updated information from different provinces and accordingly develop countermeasures. And these can be done very easily. And we have a very severe problem in terms of inter-organizational communications. This is probably because of, there is a very good communication between international organizations, say IOM or UNHCR, but we have problems of communication between Afghan ministries and international organizations. So there should be a capacity building program for the Afghan side to build the communication and establish a better communication with all these stakeholders, come up with a holistic strategy to deal with the IDP issues at the time of happening conflicts throughout this time. I hope I have answered the question.
Thank you, Dr. Siddiqui. There's another question directed towards Zahra, which says, basically, speaking from the Internal Displacement Research Program, IDP, IDPs are often seen as nationals who can't fully exercise their legal rights as citizens. But what your Syria study shows is how the social context of IDPs impacts on documentation and civil registration access and leads them to slip into formal statelessness, stateliness. This intersection between internal displacedness and statelessness is striking. Given the polarized context of that country, what are the prospects for these issues being addressed?
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the most fundamental things is prevention. I think once someone or a group of people or a community have become stateless, then it becomes incredibly difficult to resolve that situation. So what we really want to try and look at is prevention. And there are mechanisms of doing that. It's just having the will. Like you said, it's a polarized country, and that's problematic. Really trying to push for the concept and the idea that recognition does not equal legitimization, I think, is really important. If you recognize a document, just that this document means that person A and person B are married, doesn't mean you're legitimizing the country, the place or the government from which that document has come from. I think pushing for, if everybody recognizes and doesn't mean that you're legitimizing, I think that's really an important step. Increase in legal aid, increase in information awareness, because often it is the inability of IDPs to know where to go. Often the different types of civil registration mechanisms are different in the place that they're in as to what they were before. So helping them through that process can be really essential. Talking with judges and courts, asking for, sometimes we see things in Jordan where they do amnesties. So if you haven't registered, if you've gone past the deadline of birth registration, we're opening up an amnesty for a week and you can come. We're opening up an amnesty without having to pay the fine, for example, if you haven't registered your marriage. So having like amnesties and relying more on witnesses, which is something culturally that, in Syria that happens. You have a lot of, witnesses that do a lot in court. So relying more on witnesses, this child is this person's, has this person as a father, has this person as a mother, is also possible. I mean, fundamentally, the biggest thing that could be done is repealing the discrimination in the legislation, having women also give nationality to their children. But unfortunately, I think we've taken a few step backs on that because of the polarization of the conflict, where we've seen people in parliament, where we've heard people in parliament talk about the fact that that used to be something that was discussed and it's no longer being discussed. But that fundamentally would resolve a large majority of the risks of statelessness amongst these communities.
Thanks, Zahra. Thank you. There's also a question to all the speakers that says, given the case studies presented, are we right in assuming that IDPs are citizens and can and should be protected via citizens' rights? Is a different kind of legal approach needed, especially in some of the Middle East contexts where legal or de facto statelessness seems to be widely affect parts of the IDP populations? Would anyone like to respond to this question? Maybe?
I could give a few reflections, if you
Sure.
like. So I feel on the one hand, obviously the national laws should apply, and there are cases in which the national laws, when implemented effectively, would suffice. That said, there are clearly, as Zahra just mentioned, there are clearly many faults with the national laws and areas that ought to be reformed, as it embeds certain kinds of discrimination, be it gender-based, be it on the basis of religion. But I think in general, it's about the implementation of the laws. So it's necessary that there is a sensitive perspective taken for IDPs when implementing these laws, because many things in practice might not be as easy for IDPs to achieve. So, and also in many cases, the vulnerabilities are increased. So the vulnerability of the stigma that I was talking about when the child's status is registered according to the father is a perpetrator father in the case of rape is much accentuated when the child is living within an IDP camp where there is no anonymity and everybody knows who's living in each tent, and it's very pressured circumstances. So I've been in certain camps where the community have basically been referring to this is the child, this is the tent of an ISIS child. So there needs to be increased sensitivity in some cases facilitating the legal procedures that do exist, be it with a bit more flexibility in terms of witnesses who could have been present. That's my current thoughts.
Can I also say something on this? I think it's not necessarily to have another legal approach or document for this. I think because IDPs itself, they are not a foreign, they are within the responsibility of a state. It's very well known, and it's also legally, it is, for example, international established legal documents we have for that IDPs are responsibilities of states that provide basic social needs and all documents, the legal documentation required, including the identities. For example, we have similar problems in Afghanistan since it's ongoing conflict, and we have protected IDPs that are living for decades in some provinces and are first, second, third time IDPs, but they do not have access or they cannot go back to their provinces in order to prove their documentation. What they have started here in Afghanistan is that they have this biometric identity cards are provided for IDPs under the supervision of government, Ministry of Refugee and Repatriation, also with international organizations like UNHCR and IOM and others. I think this kind of approach can be done in any other country in terms of registering. And about the paternality or maternality of the IDPs in Afghanistan, or another development came, a good sign of, for example, maybe a good sign of improvement in terms of providing basic rights is this, that they have changed the IDs in terms of allowing maternal names in the IDs. Before we didn't have any section that a person could write his or her mother name, but now it is optional. They can write their mother name in their IDs. So this is an improvement. It's a very significant improvement in terms of Afghanistan, that I can say, in terms of, particularly in terms of IDPs, that they do have similar problems as Zara and Thomas mentioned, that it is in Syria. We do have similar problems here, but they're approaching in terms of providing biometric identification codes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Siddiqui. Zahra, sorry, would you like to say anything?
Very quickly, if you have time. If not, it's not a
Okay.
problem. Very quickly, just that I agree with Hidayat that I don't think there needs to be specific legislation. I think, you know, if you look at Syria, a lot of the IDPs are stateless. There are a lot of IDPs who are stateless because statelessness is not a new thing. There was large communities of stateless people pre-2011 living in Syria because of all sorts of different reasons. So they should be dealt with in the same thing, and we should be really aware of not calling someone stateless, to really make sure we're calling them citizen unless we're absolutely sure that these people are stateless. To not be like, oh, this child doesn't have a birth certificate, therefore they're stateless. That's absolutely not the case, because that also rids the state of the responsibility of them in certain levels if we start calling them stateless. And that national laws should be protective of them. And then also a thing, UNHCR should be very much involved when there are stateless persons among IDP communities, because they have a mandate for statelessness, which is not as well known a mandate as their refugee mandate. So they can be also a UN organization who very much should be involved with stateless IDPs, unlike IDPs who aren't stateless.
Thank you, Zahra. So we have a final question, which says, there are cases in Ukraine when during establishing the fact of birth on GCA, this is a court procedure on GCA, it turns out that the mother of the newborn child changed her surname according to the legislation of NGCA, took the surname of the father. And this complicates the procedure of establishing the fact of birth according to GCA procedures. If do nothing, one newborn can have two different surnames. Is there any positive experience in solving such problems in other countries? Would anyone like to respond to this question?
In Afghanistan, as I said, we have this option of writing both father and mother names and surnames, which is recently, this policy has come recently, and it is amended by the law, and also National Assembly approved it. I think there should be a kind of a monitoring in terms of, there shouldn't be a kind of any identification in terms of providing both paternal, either it should be one or the maternal side. So I don't know how this works in Ukraine, but from my experience living in Afghanistan, Turkey, and a few other countries, there is one of each. You have to choose one, either father or mother side. But most of the places maybe mother, but in countries like Afghanistan, it used to be father, but now it's like they have an option of doing mother side also. So it's a bit surprising for me that Ukraine, you can have both surnames and this kind of complication.
Thank you, Dr. Siddiqui. Thomas, would you like to add anything? I noticed your speaker is on, or?
I don't need to if we're trying to close.
Yeah, actually, it's been an excellent discussion, but it looks like that's all we have time for. So allow me to draw proceedings to a close by expressing my thanks to our three fantastic presenters today, and also to each one of you participating remotely for a great session. We look forward to seeing you for the second seminar in this series on the political identity of internal displacement, which will take place during the first week of June. And to join us, please check the events page on the IDRP website over the next week or so for events of the details. Until then, goodbye, and thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.